All right, so here we are going to look at evolution and do that part of the notes today. So I'm going to put myself in the corner somewhere so that if it helps, it helps. If it doesn't help you, let me know if it's distracting. If it does help, also let me know so that I know what you guys as a class prefer. So I will like base it on the majority of people in the class and what you guys need. All right, so first I'm going to go over early Earth and geologic time. So in order to understand evolution, which happens over time, we have to have some understanding of what early Earth was like, what would have been here, and then how geologic time, how we talk about geologic time, so we can talk about different species. All right, so the origin of life on the planet. So we have the Earth formed roughly 4.5 to 4.6 billion years ago. Life probably began between 3.53 and 3.93 billion years ago, and we'll talk about why there was that long delay in a few slides. And then we have a couple of hypotheses about how life may have started. So this origin of life is an area of a lot of like research and thought, but it's very hard to get like concrete evidence because we can't go back in time. So one of our first hypotheses is the operant hypothesis, which says that life arose gradually from inorganic molecules with building blocks like amino acids forming first and then combining to make complex polymers. And the reason I say first hypothesis, like there would have been probably many, many ideas of other people about how life started on the planet from like long times ago. However, this is one of our like first reputable scientific based hypotheses that was actually testable. Because remember, a hypothesis has to be testable. So if you have some sort of ancient Greek myth about the creation of the earth, that's not testable. So this would have been testable. We could test and see if we could design the appropriate experiment, could this have happened? So could life arise from inorganic molecules with building blocks like amino acids forming first and then eventually complex polymers? The Miller-Urey experiment did provide the first evidence that organic molecules needed for life could be formed from inorganic components, and we will talk about specifics of that shortly. And then we also have these two, the RNA world hypothesis and the metabolism world first hypothesis. The RNA world hypothesis says that the first life was self-replicating RNA, so that RNA would have started first. Metabolism first says that metabolic networks would have started prior to DNA and RNA, and then DNA and RNA would have been after that. Now, of course, these two hypotheses, they can't happen at the same time, and they're going to be a little bit harder to test than just is the operant hypothesis possible, just because designing an experiment to test those is going to be more tricky. So we're going to focus on this Miller-Urey experiment and testing that operant hypothesis. All right, just some background. You may have heard of the Big Bang Theory. The creation of the universe was probably between 13 and 14 billion years ago. Earth, 4.5 to 4.6 billion years ago. And then Earth would have cooled down around 3.8 billion years ago. And this would have been vital in order to provide an environment for most of the molecules we're going to talk about to like function. The other important piece for this is what Earth's early atmosphere would have been composed of. So it would have been ammonia, methane, water vapor, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. And this is taken from what we know about space, what we know about other planets, what we know about from looking at ancient rocks and things on Earth. So this information is being compiled from a lot of different sources. But the one thing that is missing is no oxygen. Now, I do want to point out, water vapor is H2O. There is an oxygen in there. When I say no oxygen in the atmosphere, I mean O2 gas. So this is where Miller and Urey would have gotten their like things that they wanted to add into their experiment from. They would have gotten the sources of the inorganics from this early atmosphere list of gases. The oldest fossil we have found is 3.5 billion years, and that is a prokaryotic fossil that is also anaerobic. And just a reminder, whenever we have a word that starts with A or an, that means not. So not aerobic, so it does not use oxygen. So just a refresher, when we did the cell respiration photosynthesis chapter, remember cell respiration requires oxygen, but you could make some energy doing the process of fermentation. and that does not require oxygen. So how this prokaryotic organism was doing that process may have been very different from how it is done by modern organisms, but it would have been an anaerobic process because there was no oxygen available to use. All right, so we're going to talk about the Miller-Urey experiment, and while we're doing that, I'll move that there. So this experiment was to show what could happen in Earth's early atmosphere based on what was present there, and what conditions we think were around. So here we have our gases, so methane, ammonia, hydrogen gas, and then here we have our water vapor. So we have our water that is not water vapor yet. We heat it up and the water vapor will go up the tube and into this chamber here. Then we think that the atmosphere would have been very electrically active, so lots of like lightning. So we have these two electrodes that could simulate that, so simulate the lightning in this little glass ball. After that, the drops of water vapor could go down the tube and into this condenser. The condenser would have cold water flowing in here, around the tube, and then back out. So that would help cool down the water in the tube. And it would, instead of being water vapor, it would condense into liquid water, and eventually you would get to this area where you could like turn the valve and you could get some of the water drops out and you could collect it. And once you collected it and sampled that for chemicals, we saw that it did contain organic compounds, and those specifically were amino acids. So this was the first proof that we could make organic compounds from inorganics. And just a reminder, amino acids. So we've got our central carbon, our amine group, our carboxyl group, our hydrogen, and then our R group. So these amino acids, much more complicated than this. Also, our amino acids, remember, will form by peptide bonds into polypeptides, which could be like enzymes or proteins. So we are starting to get like larger organic molecules. All right, so here, we're not going to talk about plants, so I'll just cover that up. Life's natural history is a record of successions and extinctions. And I wanted to show you this before I showed you the rest, because this is where I think we kind of get to the more modern day discussion of evolution, is because of one thing on this graph that we can see very clearly. So if you look at the top, on here we're looking at time, so the oldest is down here, and then this black line at the top is now. So this like line at the very top of the quaternary, just below that line on the table, is now. And these are all of the different periods of like geological time. And what we can see is that those anaerobic bacteria came first, then photosynthetic. So this is showing us all the different groups. But the thing I want to point out before we continue is that this one does not reach to now. And I think this is why people really started to get interested, because the time that we're going to talk about as we get into the evolution part of the history of evolution in the next, like, I don't know, 2 or 3 days, we're talking about like the 1700s. And this is when people really started to collect things that are dinosaur bones, that were these giant organisms. And people realized that, like, hey, these are not like the things we have today. And I think that's one of the main things that helped people start thinking about evolution in the way that we think about it more commonly today. All right. And then this diagram just kind of shows you some of the diversity of life as you go from Precambrian at the very bottom, simple organisms, all the way up to, you know, the more complex. All right. So here is our geologic time scale. I'm going to go ahead and move this somewhere else, showing you our different types of divisions. So we have 4 ways to talk about the divisions of geologic time. You should know which one is the biggest, which is the smallest. So in order, our eon is our largest division. Next, we have eras. So each eon would be broken up into multiple eras. So the Phanerozoic, which is our current eon, is broken up into the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic era. So our current era is the Cenozoic. Then we have periods. So periods are third. Our current period is the quaternary period, because remember, today is at the very top, just like on that other. thing, and then the oldest is down here. All right, so quaternary is our current period, and you might recognize some of those. These ones in particular, the Mesozoic periods, so the Cretaceous, Jurassic, and Triassic. This is where we have dinosaurs. These ones we hear about in the movies and stuff. You don't hear as much about like the Silurian or the Paleogene as we do about those three. And then our epoch. And our current epoch is the Holocene. Now, I don't expect you to memorize all of these. What I do expect you to know is I expect you to know where we are currently. So our current eon, era, period, and epoch, and also to know like which one is the biggest and which one is the smallest. I usually just remember that they're in alphabetical order except for epoch, which comes last, because with 3 that start with the letter E, it's really hard to make like a mnemonic device. All right, the other thing I want to talk about is how we determined these times. So initially, timescale was based on examining layers of sedimentary rock, looking at which layers were deeper underground and which layers were closer to the surface. Deeper layers are going to be older. Layers closer to the surface are going to be newer. And this gave us relative dating. We could say that like this rock is younger compared to this rock below it. Radiometric dating allowed us to get an absolute date by looking at different compounds within the rock. Not all rocks can be dated this way, but using what we can, we've come up with some absolute numbers that we can put here for the dates for like the beginning of the Holocene at 11.8 thousand years ago. And one thing I do want to mention on here, the GA is the same as BYA, so it's billion years ago. I think it stands for something like giga-annum, but it means the same thing mathematically. All right, so here's an example of that relative dating. So if we're looking at relative dating, the younger layers are going to be at the top, the older layers at the bottom. So here we have our oldest layer, the Supai group, our youngest layer, the Kaibab limestone. If you look at this one over here where we don't see the like color coding, you can see that there's differences in the rock just based on like what's growing there. So here we have, looks like some greenery. This sandstone thing though is quite sheer with nothing growing on it. So it's kind of a straight down drop. And that would be because of the differential rates of erosion for like sandstone versus this Toroweap foundation versus the shale here. So some things are going to erode faster than others. We can also look at like the composition of those rocks with like the different minerals and elements in them to see that they are different layers. So to know that like the layer doesn't get divided here, it gets divided like that. So not like that, if that makes any sense. Hopefully it does make sense. Let me know if it doesn't so that I can help. You will have to answer these questions as part of the remote learning if you're doing remote today. So go ahead, and if you don't understand the layers, answer those questions or just tell me that you don't understand and let me know. That way I can, figure out some way to explain it or send you some other resources. All right, layer A is basalt from a lava tube, so it's going into the layers of rock. And this you don't need to know, but to find an easy question to give you for practice was pretty hard because most of the ones online are like intense geologist kind of questions for like a course in geology. So layer A is going to be basalt formed from a lava tube. It's younger than any of the layer it goes through. So we know that it has to be younger than B, C, and D. It could possibly be younger than E and the lava just didn't reach that far. This is just like the lava that's coming up from the center of the earth. So A is going to be younger than B, C, and D at least. But what I want you to do is to tell me which of the layers is the oldest between B, D, C, and E, and which one is the youngest. So you'll turn that in as proof that you watched this video today. And that is all for notes. The next one is terms to know, and that will be a video for the next day of notes. So you will be able to find that one on PowerSchool when you're ready.